Hi and welcome back to a very dark and gruesome FindersBeepers History Seekers. This week we're looking into the murders of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. And what went off here was absolutely horrendous. Now I'm actually in the prison, or one of the prison blocks where prisoners were kept, and this is one of the beds. Now it's quite shocking, this video, in that I think there's going to be quite a lot of things in it that are quite close to the bone. For example, that's a picture there of one of the last 14 people to be killed. There's 200,000 graves, mass graves of these people in Cambodia that were killed under the rule of Pol Pot. Now Pol Pot, you would think, was quite a decent guy. He went off and got his education in Paris. He got in with the Communist Party and decided to move back to Cambodia, take over, and became one of the most ruthless leaders in the history of Asia. And what went off here is just awful. It really is absolutely terrible. Now, while we're near one of these blocks, I'll show you. These were some of the people that were killed or were kept in this room. Look at their ages, right from 21, 19, right up to 57, and it wasn't just men, it was women as well. Right in the late 80s, so just before I was born. Each one of the cells shows one of the victims and them laying out on this exact bed in this exact room when they'd been tortured, and most of the ones in here were political. Let me just give you a bit more of a background. Let me tell you a little bit more of the reasons behind this before we get looking around things. Pol Pot was born to a relatively okay family. His dad was in farming. They weren't short of a penny, and because of that they got quite good contacts. Now, growing up, Pol Pot ended up going and hanging around at the king's residence, and at a young age was having sexual contact with the concubines, the king's concubines. So he was a little bit ahead of where he should have been developmentally. And then he went off to university in Paris because there's a massive connection to France. Over here in Cambodia, there was the settlement of the French here, and ultimately there was an uprising of the Cambodians against the French government, and they gained their independence. But while Pol Pot was over in France, he had quite strong feelings of how he wanted Cambodia to be. And one of the things was he liked the idea of what Hitler had brought up with the ethnic cleansing, getting rid of the Vietnamese out of the country, and a whole host of other people, and any sort of political past he wanted wiping out altogether. So when he came back to the country, he basically started off on a quest of putting a group of people together, because he'd got in with the communists and like the extremist cells when he was in France, and he had time to think and to plan, and by the time he came back he was ready to start off. And that started by setting up the Khmer Rouge. Now the Khmer Rouge wore all black, and they wore like red and white checked scarves, and they went on a rampage, originally quite peacefully, and then through coercion and violence it came that they ended up sort of owning the country, or being in charge of the country. Now, I don't want to go too deep into the history and of like every last bit of what happened, because it is quite extensive. However, they If you want to look up anything to do with that side of things, there's loads online, absolutely loads. I just want to give you more of a visual of what happened here, and we'll go to a couple of different sites. I am literally stood next to the gallows at the moment. It's just all very sad and very scary, but I'll show you everything that's here and at the other site that we're going to in a little bit. Now, like I mentioned, this block, there's cells all the way around. Up on the top levels, people were thrown over the edges of these. All sorts of things happened to them. And this is the gallows. While we stood next to it, we may as well talk about it. Now, although people were hung, as you would think traditionally, from this gallows behind, it was actually few and far between. If you can see just up there, there's like a little circular hook. Now that was used to string them up by their wrists behind their back. Now think about putting your hands behind your back and somebody pushing you and pulling your arms. It would absolutely kill. Now being pulled by those up above your head, it would be excruciating. It'd be absolutely terrible. Now, that was what the Khmer Rouge was about. It wasn't just about killing people. It was about the torture, the pain, the suffering. It wasn't just, let's shoot you all and stick you in a mass grave. It was real nasty stuff, nasty stuff. Now you can see on this picture exactly what it would have been like and how painful that must have been, having your arms stretched up behind you and lifted into the air. And they used to do it to up to 3 people at a time. Now if you look on the left hand side of that, there's also someone being dunked into pots, and these are those exact pots that they used to use. You can imagine being pushed under there and the pure panic. It would be my absolute worst nightmare. You know, the thought of being trapped underwater is just awful, absolutely terrible. I could not bear thinking about it. And these are the exact pots where people would have been half drowned but just kept alive, thrown back in their cell, ready to go again the next day. Now the thing that it makes me think of is like a cat toying with a mouse, knowing ultimately it's going to kill it, but it just wants to play with its prey first. It's just barbaric. It really is barbaric. The thought of what one person can do to someone else just because of their political background, religious background, or even just because they go against their views. They were somebody that, not necessarily even now, somebody that might have been on a political party when they were in their late teens and they're associated with that, but now they've grown up, they may have changed how they feel, but just because of those connections, they were dragged off to somewhere like this. Now, you might think this place was a one-off, like it was a small thing that was happening throughout the country, but you couldn't be much further from the truth. This was one of 150 to 196 different places just like this where people were brought and imprisoned, and in this single one, 20,000 people were brought here and were killed. Now within these walls, and actually it is only quite a small area, if you look round, that's the outside of it. It does extend slightly behind this building, but not very far. There was 1,000 people at a time kept in here. 1,000 people kept in the cells, kept in this area. You've still got the original barbed wire up on the fences that kept them in, and there was many failed attempts to escape from this place. The thing is, even if you did escape, it wouldn't be very long before you were caught again. And this is all the original barbed wire and razor wire from the back in the day. Now you might be thinking, what was the reason for the torture? What was the reason for the pain and suffering? Why did they do it? And basically they wanted to expunge every single last bit of competition. Every single last government person that would oppose them. So what they used to do was bring, say, some government ministers in, previous government ministers, and they'd torture them until they gave out 10 names. So family members, other people that worked in the government and things like that. And then they'd bring those 10 people in and kill the person that gave the information. And they would keep doing that over and over again until hundreds of thousands of people had died in the same way. Now, when I came in here, I felt like this feels a little bit like a school. And that's because originally it was a school building. It was used, these were all classrooms used for children. And I thought, what an odd building to use. But if you think about it, the small classrooms, it makes so much sense to have similar sized rooms for interrogation rooms and other things similar. Now, if you look in these rooms, it tells you and shows you some of the people that were kept here, and it just is unbelievable. Looking at the people on here, like, look how young some of these people look. They don't look like they could rise up and cause problems for the country. They're just normal kids, normal people. How horrendous is that? And it's, like I said, it's not just men, it's women. And some of the things that happen to these women are just unbelievable. Now, as the torture and starvation continued, they were told that if they gave these names up and they released who it was that had been involved in it as well, they would be allowed to leave. So eventually they decided they would give up the names of their loved ones, of their friends, of their colleagues, not knowing that they would then be left to die, slowly starved to death, or murdered in the most diabolical way. And this next little bit, it's if you're not the sort of person that likes seeing disturbing images, you're probably best to look away now. Now, when you look at the faces of these men, they're quite defiant looking, quite strong looking. But then if you look at photographs of people further down the line of interrogation and being treated so badly, it's horrendous. And again, I must warn you, this is not for the faint-hearted amongst you. Now, what the Khmer Rouge like to do is do a bit of a before and after, showing the people how they were when they were brought into here and how they ended up. And some of the pictures in here are just horrendous, terrible. You would think that photographs like this were taken by the people that tried to save them, to document what had happened. But these photos were taken by the people that caused the damage, almost like they were showing off. They were saying, look what we've done, and if you oppose us, this is what ends up happening to you. What sort of person does that to another person? I just can't get my head around it. It's horrible, it's horrible. Like this video, I've been wanting to do this video for ages because I think it's something that, I don't know, because it's not part of Western history. It's not like England, France, Germany, America. We weren't involved in it really, because the French had been pushed out of the country. I think it's been sort of put under the rug a little bit. Like, it was maybe not the scale of Nazi Germany, but it was almost worse. The way that these people were treated for no real reason is just awful. And I think it hits home even more when you see some of the photos, you see some of the people that this happened to. It just goes through me. I can't really take it in of what these people must have had to do and suffer. It was horrendous. And the thing is, you think it's maybe 1 or 2 rooms of these photos of all these people, but it goes on and on and on. Every room. Now, one of the things that I thought of straight away is what happened to the kids of these people? Like, they were imprisoned. What happened to their children? I really wish I never even looked into that. So some of the babies were held by the ankles and clubbed round a tree, instantly killing them. Not always instantly killing them. Some of the older kids were used and sent out into the fields to work 18-hour days with 1 bowl of rice per person with a small amount of salt in each bowl. So they eventually starved to death after hours. And I've been in this country like a few days, and the heat is unbearable. Like, it's one thing being able to just go in and get a bottle of water when you want one, and these places, it's unimaginable being in these hot fields with no water, no food, going for 18 hours a day, being given 1 small ration, and then the same again, day after day after day, until ultimately, I'm pretty sure the same thing happened to most of them. It was the pure inhuman acts that happened here that made it so bad. Obviously torture and the deaths, but they ultimately didn't want people to die. They wanted them to suffer. So when you were brought here, you were stripped to your underwear. All your possessions were taken away. Your name was taken away. You were given a number, and that was it. So your identity was taken straight away, which is the biggest part of you. You were unable to talk to anybody at any time of the day, unless you were spoken to by a guard, which was also something that the people in charge didn't want to happen. They didn't want you to talk to other people, regardless of whether you were a guard or somebody in here. So that was something that was avoided at all costs. Then, in addition to that, you were chained, and there was 2 sorts of cells. The first sort was a small cell where there was a chain that ran along the wall, and you would be individually chained to those. Or if you were in one of the bigger rooms, there was 3 chains that ran across the room, and each person was chained round about 1 metre apart from each other, and you would sleep there, you would eat there, you would stay there the majority of the day apart from when you were working or you were being tortured without speaking to anybody. Can you imagine that life? Can you imagine going from a normal everyday life to that? Now, guards even got beatings, and they got beatings when the inmates committed suicide. So they did everything in their power to make sure there was nothing possible that could cause them to commit suicide. So they would strip them naked every day, search them, hose them down every 3 days to get rid of lice, to get rid of any other diseases, but it was rife in there. There was so many bad things going round, but they didn't want that to happen because they wanted them to rot, to basically stay there and just rot, which is horrendous. Like I said, this is my point about why do people do this to other people? Now, a lot of the things that were in here were from the school. So you had the original old school benches. They used things like pencils to torture them, shoving them in their ears, up their noses, blinding them. The inmates were made to fight each other, but only enough to wound, not to kill. So things like that didn't force them to die because, like I said, they didn't want them to die. Now, like I said before, what's coming up next is likely to shock and upset, but I feel like it needs to be shown just to hit home how awful this is, really. Now, I just wanted to show you these shackles because we will see those in a minute. They were on about a minute ago being tied up in the room next to each other, and I'll show you those when we get through. But also, some of the people just didn't end up in a very good state. And this next room really highlights that, and it shows what it would have been like to be in somewhere like this. I just can't get my head around it, really. So these are the shackles where hands or feet would have been placed, mainly feet, so you couldn't get out of the sitting or laying position. And if you see the hooks on the floor, that's where they would have fastened on, so there'd have been a row of them across, giving you next to no room to do anything, really. Now there's multiple images of people that have died in here, and on the other side of that board there's hundreds more, and I don't really want that imagery on the channel. I want to mention them. I don't feel like it's right to show in detail, but I also feel like it needs to be mentioned. Now the mass graves are all over this country. Everywhere in Cambodia, there's, I think 2.6 million is the estimated amount. However, they keep finding new ones, so there's no way of knowing how many people were put to death or starved. Now I know I said I wouldn't show the dead bodies, but I think when they've become skeletons, they almost lose their personality, whereas the photos on the wall were people's faces, were people that could be recognised, and it's harrowing. It really is harrowing. How could a place like this go from a school, even during the Civil War, a school full of laughter, full of happiness, full of friends, to then be turned into something so evil, with barbed wire stopping people escaping in bars? I just don't understand how something can change so quickly. Now, as I mentioned, the large rooms with the rows and rows of shackles, these were the small cells where things were separated up, and each prisoner was fastened to the wall and wasn't allowed to leave. Each small cell is roughly 3.5 to 4 foot by 5 foot, meaning you barely got enough room to lie down. You weren't allowed to talk, even though you got a person next to you on each side. There was no talking. Now, a guard used to sit outside at night, but I'm sure there would have been whispers in the night, but I wouldn't have wanted to get caught for speaking or doing anything against the rules. Look at the room to get out of these places. It's a real struggle. And the cells continue down there. Roughly built, no creature comforts, just quickly put up to house people. You can't really call it being housed though, can you? You may as well have been out on the streets. Now, as new prisoners were brought in, new cells were added. Now, these doors wouldn't have been here to break it up. You literally had to come through the entrance here, and this is where the guard would have sat to stop anybody getting out. These have just been added so people can walk through and view the place. But as you can see, these were all individual cells. You could always be seen through the little hole as well, sat up against the wall, able to look outside and wonder what normal life was like these days. It's just like, it's what I've been to prisons before. I've been to loads of different prisons and places like mental asylums and one thing or another. And even though the mental asylums, a lot of the time you ended up there and you didn't deserve to be there, these you truly didn't. You could be a child that was a relative of somebody that worked as a soldier or in the government, and you ended up locked up somewhere like this, slowly starving to death being hung up by your wrists on a daily basis, half drowned, waterboarded. The tortures went on, and I'm pretty sure somewhere in here is some of the methods of torture that have been left behind. Now, I was mentioning a minute ago how they tried to keep certain people alive for as long as possible to give them the ultimate punishment. Now, it didn't work like that with everybody. If you weren't deemed as important, as needed, you were just killed. It was as simple as that. You were brought in, you were interrogated, you had to tell your life story. As soon as you came, you had to give a day by day, month by month background story of your life and why you got to where you got to. Now, most people were sent away. Most normal people, if they had no suspicion of you being involved in the government, the army, or anything like that, they would send people from the city to go and work in the countryside, and they would work their 18-hour days with hardly any food and slowly starve to death. But if they got wind of you having some connections, they'd bring you back here, and they'd bring you and your entire family. Now, more than likely, when you walked through the doors, your children would be taken away, and your wife, and instantly murdered. A lot of the children and the wives were raped and then murdered, which was horrendous in front of their own families. And then the torture began. Now, in this room, there's multiple skulls and remains of the countless victims that stayed here, from rib bones to skulls, and there's more. There's so many more. Absolutely loads of them. It's horrific. Now, have you ever wondered why they seem to be in a very pushed forward position, heads pushed forward, looking like they're being forced into that position? That's because they are, and this is why. It's a bit hard to show you because it's behind glass, but it's a machine that pushed, and you can see on that lady there, pushed your head slightly forward so they could you could sit on a chair and they would take the photograph of you to document you. Now, when this place was finally overturned in the late 1970s, just before I was born, I think it was January 1979, they found millions of records, thousands, hundreds of thousands of photos of these people that have been brought here, and their lives documented, and their connections, and who needed to be picked up because they'd informed on them after hours of torture. And we're going into the room next door that shows some of the implements of torture. So, as you would expect, there's things like bats and sticks and axes, but some of the stuff in the room next door is mind-blowing. It really is, and it shows some of the things that happened to the people that were here. The torture, babies being taken away from mothers. It's horrendous. It really, really is. And also, I think when you see how they were housed in here, I am sorry because it's really hard with the reflection, but lined up next to each other, unable to speak, just with a number. And you see on a lot of the photos, if you look at the photos of the people, they've all got a number. And so if you see a number repeated, that's because one person's died and has been replaced. So, for example, this guy was number 145, and so was this guy. But if we look on that picture, his number will have been on the wall, and that's where he will have lined up. But as soon as he died, he would have been replaced by somebody else. And you see multiple numbers over and over and over again, which really shows how fast and how quick people died in here. Now this is something you probably will have heard of, but will have never really thought what it looked like. The implement. Now this is for waterboarding. So as you can see on that picture over there, they fasten you with your feet fastened to the bottom and your arms fastened to the top. They get this big self-made watering can, cover your face with a cloth and constantly pour water on, so you're unable to breathe, and the panic must have been horrendous. That for me is one of the worst things that could possibly happen, apart from possibly this one. So this was a massive water tank, and as you can see on that there, they'd fasten both your arms, your wrists to here, your head would be shoved under, your feet would be fastened inside there, and unless they lifted your head up, you would slowly drown. But they didn't want you to drown, they wanted you to suffer. Same again with the barrel, where they'd lift you out by your ankles and then slowly drop you in again, over and over, and your wrists would be fastened to the bottom as well. So it was down to them how long you stayed under, and there was people that stayed under far too long and just died. But they didn't want that. They wanted the torture, they wanted the pain, so you would give away people's names. Now boxes like these were used to put things like snakes in, stuff that might bite, rats that had been starved for days, and you'd be made to put your arm in there with it. They'd also remove body parts. You'd be left starving in your cell for days and days. You'd have fingers extracted whilst fastened to the floor and being whipped. There was thousands and thousands of different tortures, all to make you say someone's name who may have nothing to do with the political side of things, but to stop the pain, you say their name. Now it wasn't just the locals that succumbed to this place. There was quite famously a New Zealand guy called Kerry Hamill, and he was caught on an island not far from here, brought in and tortured, and eventually died. And his brother committed suicide from depression years later after finding out about what happened to his brother. And it affected people all around the world. So this is why I don't really understand why it's not something that's talked about. Like World War II, I know obviously it was on a lot bigger scale, but there's still 2.6 million people that died from starvation, that died from torture and murder, and how is this not something we talk about more? It's madness. But there's more things to show you yet. Now this room houses the skulls and bones of many of the victims, and there's full cabinets full of skulls. It also shows some of the terrible things that happened to them. It tells you, not that you can really see, but it tells you what it was that caused it, whether it be a weapon or a spike or a gunshot wound that caused the death of each of these people. They've all got little holes or big holes in the tops of their heads. But like I say, there's just so many. However, we're now going somewhere where it's 10 times worse for bodies and for the dead. We're going to the killing fields. Right, so we're now at the killing grounds, about 3 or 4 miles away from where we were previously. This is the spot where the truck used to bring the people. They used to come in through the main entrance up there. The truck would stop here and everybody would pile off. So when I mentioned to you the children and the wives of the people that were kept in the prison, this is where they were brought. Also, if you remember the holes in the tops of the skulls, I was just reading a minute ago about, rather than waste bullets on people, they'd get them to kneel down, they'd get a pickaxe, use the sharp end, and just dive it straight into the brain, killing them instantly. And that's why people were brought here. This is where the mass graves were. Just in front of where the monument sits now, there was a hut, and it covered pretty much this whole area. 300 people would be brought in on the trucks over a period of time and put in there, all sat in there knowing pretty much what was coming. And then one by one they'd be taken, probably the next day, out of the hut. They had to kneel down in front of the hut. Sometimes they were blindfolded, sometimes they weren't, and they were kneeled down and they were executed, and then your number was called and it was your turn. Each day the people, the security who worked here, used to draw lots, and whoever lost would be classed as the executioner for that day. Now their hut was just underneath these trees, right next to where the 300 people were that they killed each day. Now each day there was lots drawn with the security to work out who it was who was going to be the executioner for that day. Some of them really liked doing it, some of them not so much, but it was drawn each day, and the hut where they stayed and prepared themselves was just behind us under those trees. Now just behind these trees there was a hut that held all the chemicals right next to where the executioner was, and he used to come after he'd killed the 300 people to get some chemicals to put on top of them to make them deteriorate quicker and a lot easier to dispose of. Now it's a process, it's a process of like something almost like you'd do with animals. I don't know, like butchery or whatever, herding them all together, dispatching them, treating them, and then moving on to the next. It's just sickening. It really is. Now just over the back from here there's a school, and they've just been out in the playground all singing, and it's just so sad to think that kids like them would have been herded here in their hundreds and thousands and killed one by one. Now they have said on the entrance as you come in that you may see bones sticking out through the ground. Now I've not seen any as of yet. You're under strict instructions not to touch them, or even you don't need to tell them about them. Bones are making their way through up to the surface all the time. Now they made an agreement, I think in the early 2000s, not to remove any more bones or any more bodies from the ground, just to leave them out of respect, rather than digging them up and putting them on display, to leave them where they are. Right, this area here is where they kept all the tools of murder, all the sort of killing tools that they used on the people just over there. Now when this place was discovered in 1979, everything was there, but within a couple of days it'd all been taken away, and not by the people that had discovered it, by some locals or someone. They have no idea where all of those things disappeared to. Now inside the tower where we're going to go shortly are the skulls of over 5,000 people. Now 9,000 bodies have been found on this site, and this is just one of the graves where 450 people were found, just dumped in one small hole. You can't even imagine 450 people fitting in here, so they must have been deep, with people on top of other people. It's horrendous. And as you can see by the holes in the ground, that's just one of many. Reaches right up to the end of there as well. Lots of pits where they've dug bodies up, and all this side hasn't been touched, and it will be just as many if not more. Is it just me, or I don't understand how it gets to this. I don't understand how somebody just one day decides, right, that's it, I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna lead all these people. How do they get in that position where people go, you know what, okay, yeah, we'll do that. we'll kill our own people, we'll imprison our cousins, our brothers, our relatives, our next door neighbours. We'll send them away to the countryside to work for 18-hour days with hardly any food. Why do they listen to one person that then suddenly gets an army behind him, and then the army gets the rest of the country behind him? Why? How does that even happen? I don't understand that. That's the bit of it I never get. Like, politics is one thing, but I just feel like if today, say the British government turned round and said, right, everybody's got to go to the countryside, and the people that don't go to the countryside are going to be shot. I don't think it would happen. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being very naive, but it just doesn't seem right. Now, as you walk round, you start to notice more and more ditches where they've excavated and removed countless bodies, and it's just sickening. If you think each one of these is like 400 or 500 people, and they're all over, there's loads of them, it's just crazy. Now, they built a couple of ditches and a pond down there to stop things being washed away, and like I was saying a minute ago about bones and teeth, they can be seen sort of scattered about all over where the water's started to wash them away down there. Now, I'm used to coming to museums and places like this, but not like this. So you're used to seeing, I don't know, maybe fragments of pottery in the ground from the Roman times, or maybe, I don't know, coins or something that they found. The stuff here isn't from hundreds of years ago, it's from 50 years ago. Well, it's from anything round about 44 years ago, because that's when I was born. And it's awful. It's awful. So you can see they've left sections where the skulls and bones are still there. These are the bits that they found today, not over the last couple of months or weeks. These are the bits that they found today and moved. They're to tie around your wrists to stop people moving about. That's bullets out of a clip and bits of bones, and that's what people have found walking around today and brought here. Also, if you look carefully at the edge of these pits, you can see that there's items of clothing just strewn about, and that's not just where people have thrown stuff, that's bits of the people's clothing from 50 years ago. Well, another piece there. It's beyond awful. As you're walking around, you just keep spotting them. There's stuff hanging on trees and like in the roots. I don't know what these two piles are here. I've been trying to work out what they are. I don't know whether that's where they've emptied stuff out and it may still have remains in. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't know. The clothes are doing it even more than the bones in my head. They're making me feel more sad than the bones are. Maybe that's just the background of going around abandoned buildings for me, knowing that people leave their clothes behind and it's the stuff that they pick up every day. I think I've almost disjointed myself from the actual bones, because I can't imagine them as being people. I know that sounds awful, but I don't know whether it's just like a coping mechanism where my brain's not connecting the two, but it's horrible. Now, on this tree, you'll notice there's bracelets and things hung up on it, little teddies, offerings that people have left. You don't want to know why. So this tree at some point was used as a loudspeaker, to put the loudspeaker to cover up the moans and the sounds of dying people. However, it was also used for something a lot more gruesome. And this is probably the worst thing in here. In my opinion, this is the worst. So I was talking about it in the prison, how they used to get the babies by the ankles and smash them against this tree. I think there's two trees in here that they specifically used, and they also used to tie the small children to it away from their parents and kill them. It's just disgusting. Now the second of the trees is just up there, but this is another collection of bits of bone that will end up in the main tower over there, but they add to this until it's full and then move it over there once it's full. Just look at the piles and piles of teeth and bone, and another thing to, I'm guessing, tie people up with. It's awful. So as you can see, this is the most famous, the Chan Kiri tree, the killing tree. The tree which the executioners smashed the children's head against. Absolutely. It makes me quite emotional, because think about your own kids. Think about the situation that got them in this. They did nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong, and hundreds of children have died for absolutely nothing. And it says right in front of me on the sign, this mass grave was full of naked women and children, and I don't think I need to go into detail why. So I've just been reading this sign, and these are the rags of the clothing of the people. Now, the reason they're all in here is they took out all the bodies and the bones, and then a few days later, after some rain, these all appeared on the surface because the bones had been the only things holding them down, and they came straight up through this sand, because it's quite a sandy floor here, and then there's piles and piles of clothing, and they're still coming up to this day. And then finally, this was placed here in the 90s as a remembrance of all the people that lost their lives. So roughly 1,500 people through murder, and the rest through starvation on the fields. I think seeing all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of skulls all staring back at you makes you realise how awful this was. It was a massacre on a huge scale of his own people. And it shows on here evidence of killing with a cleaning rod, a bayonet, a bullet, tooth treatment, killing with iron tool, wooden stick, and being pushed against a wall. So all the different dots on there are the different things and the different reasons for death. And it just goes on and on and on. All four sides of the building are exactly the same. Just bones after bones, skulls after skulls. It is just awful. Now, when I was at the prison not that long ago, I got stopped by a man from England who told me off for filming. He said, "You shouldn't be filming this, it's disrespectful." And as I was about to speak to him, another guy came from behind me who came from here, and he said, "No, the world needs to know about this, the world needs to know what's happened." And I totally couldn't agree more. We had a big conversation about it, to be fair, and the amount of people that haven't ever heard of Pol Pot, it was 50 years ago, so it was within our lifetime. I'm 44, this ended in 1979, the year I was born. And really, I didn't know much about it. I'd heard the name Pol Pot. My dad had mentioned it at some point when I was younger. But other than that, I knew nothing about it, and I would put money on that the majority of people have never heard of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot that are my age. Very, very rare, I would have thought. So this is why we need to talk about it, because otherwise things like this will happen again. And we do need to look after each other, and we need to make sure that our neighbours are okay, not just ourselves. and we need to think about these people and think what they had to put up with. Anyway, I know this has been a bit dark. I know this has not really been my normal style of video, and it's something I felt I couldn't miss doing while I was here. I've been and I've seen an amazing temple that's 1,000 years worth of history, but also history from just 50 years ago is just as important, but for totally different reasons. Right, love you all, look after each other, I'll speak to you soon.